Our next speaker is going to pick up on precisely the frame that the previous Frank left off with. It will be another Frank, our own Frank Felder, who is director of the Center for Energy, Economic, and Environmental Policy at the Bloustein School of Planning and Public Policy here at Rutgers. Frank is both an engineer and a policy person with an undergraduate degree from Columbia and master's and doctorates from M.I.T. He is also a great resource that we have here at Rutgers. He is basically the expert that the BPU, the Board of Public Utilities, turns to do analyses of the electricity system here in New Jersey. And he's going to pick up on the question of the potential for a death spiral in electricity rates. Frank?
Great. Well, good morning. Thank you for having me. Thank you again, Paul, for all your work and your colleagues' work with the Rutgers Energy Institute. Just to highlight or provide specific examples, I've had students with Professor Seneca and I taught in a Burns seminar, who then later applied and were accepted to do an internship through the REI over the summer. And then they go on to be graduate students here and do doctoral work as well. So there's a real continuity of students, and picking them up at the start or near the start of the undergraduate education all the way through is an amazing accomplishment in such a short period of time. So what I suggest is break out your phones, your iPads, your laptops, because although the title is somewhat jazzy and sexy about death spirals, it's going to quickly devolve into a discussion about rate design. And there's nothing more tedious than an engineer talking about rate design in the electric power industry. So I won't feel insulted. So please walk out, get a cup of coffee, make new friends. What I want to do, though, is, and I think the theme of this is the integration, and Paul referenced the multidisciplinary, or the interdisciplinary, I like that word even better, between the sciences, and it's always fun when I hear the word sciences, because I think people typically mean a natural scientist or a physical scientist, but we should probably include social scientists as well. But the integration of the various disciplines to actually move energy policy in a more useful direction. And I think beneath all these discussions, as a former professor of mine said, we're really discussing and debating how we should live our lives. And that's a fundamental philosophical and political questions where technologists and people like me may be able to help, but deep down I think there are these, and I think that Congressman alluded to these deeper currents that we have to figure out how to address, as well as improving the technologies and economics. But in any event, I want to talk about that integration, or use this subject as talking about the integration between those various approaches, the importance of having an interdisciplinary approach, and also perhaps touch on our rhetoric going forward. So before you go to your phones or tune out, what's the answer to this question? Well, in one word is no. I don't think this is a real problem. It's a fun problem. It's made the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, and their website's dedicated to the utility death spiral. You can go to a website that just has images on the utility death spiral, and I'll reference those coming along. So in one word, no. In two words, it should not. We can get it wrong. I don't think we will. We may not get there correctly or quickly or directly, but I think we can address this issue, and I'll talk about the conditions under which I think that makes sense. And if you really want to listen to the rest of this presentation, I'll give you the more complete answer. So I don't think the utility's existence, and here utility, I'm really emphasizing the transmission and distribution. I realize there's a generation piece, but for this talk, let's just focus in on the T&D, the transmission and distribution. I don't think its existence is in question. I think what it does, its essence is in question. And I'll explain that as we go. This is an exciting time to be a utility analyst or electric power industry analyst. It's a very difficult time, I think, for regulators like former President Commissioner Fox and others and our staff here, because everything's up for grabs. The purpose of the industry is up for grabs. We knew what the electric power industry was going to do in the 1940s. If it didn't move, we electrified it. It was almost that simple. Perhaps we had some trolleys that were electric as well. The strategy, the technological strategy was simple: economies of scale. Bigger is better. Centralized power plants, push power, you and I, we just got it. And the industry structure was completely regulated, integrated, regulated utility, although that has now transitioned to this hybrid structure where we have markets and different types of markets, at least on the generation side to varying degrees, and in some places on the retail side. But for now, right now, the whole industry, the fundamental questions, what is it, what should it do today, are open, and it makes it really an exciting time. But I don't think the industry itself, the existence of it, is in question. Just to ground us, this is a simplified description of the grid. For you MBAs out here, this is the supply chain. Very linear, doesn't capture the network piece of the grid. The grid I'm talking about, I'm stretching the word in this context, is transmission and distribution, which is the green and the blue stuff. And the bugaboo, let's say, is behind the meter generation. Now, I'm going to use the example of solar. This isn't a veiled attack upon solar. I think solar is a great technology. I think it has a huge role to play, an increasing role. But I'm just going to use that as an example to get at this notion of the death spiral. It doesn't have to be solar. It could be any generation behind the meter. It could also be demand response, energy efficiency as well. But we'll just to illustrate, for a broad audience, to provide us some stylized examples that aren't completely accurate, I'll probably slip into talking about solar. Okay, so we're going to talk about the blue and the green, the transmission and distribution system. So what are the economic characteristics which flow directly from the engineering or the physical characteristics of the system? They have high fixed costs. Just think about a transmission line. You don't need much labor to operate a transmission line. You need a lot of capital to build the tower, the line, and so forth. Of course, you need operations and maintenance, but it's a high fixed cost industry. Same thing with distribution assets, although they require more personnel. There are large economies of scale, at least historically there have been, and they continue on the T&D side, perhaps not on the generation side. And what this means is the investments are sunk. They're irreversible. If you build a transmission and distribution line and you decide as a policy matter we're going to pay for it over 30 years, a logical decision given the long-lived assets, nature of those assets, and 10 years into it you say, well, this isn't working out, you can't convert that asset cost effectively to something else. It's a transmission or it's a distribution line. You just don't pick it up and move it like an airplane or a computer that has multiple uses. And so it's that irreversibility that's a key issue, and hence rate recovery and rate design in order to induce investors to make those long-term commitments with the opportunity, not the right, but the opportunity to earn their cost of capital back. Okay, so where are we? Well, primarily in the U.S., fixed charges, particularly in your residential bill, are recovered via from a variable charge. And we'll show some examples in a moment, but basically part of your per kilowatt hour charge, 20 cents, I'm just making up a number per kilowatt hour, is these fixed assets. That, as Frank previously mentioned, that has implications, particularly in times of low growth, on the financial viability of the utility. In addition, rightly so, many states, including New Jersey, have policies that provide strong incentives for behind-the-meter generation. They're driven by a variety of factors: economic development, environmental, reliability. There's a set of reasons behind them, which is important why energy policy is just not limited to energy security or economic development, all of these. And as a result, when these policies were in a small percentage, when only one in 10,000 people had a solar panel, these incentive policies, I'm going to use the word subsidy, the rest of them you get plenty of subsidies. I'm just using it as a technical term. These additional incentives really didn't matter. They were just kind of peanut butter spread throughout the bill. And so you had the total cost and the rates that, I'm oversimplifying Mark's job by a lot, but what public utility commissions, or in New Jersey, the Board of Public Utility Commission did was to figure out for various rate class the total cost divided by quantity, the total annual cost, revenue requirement, and that was the average cost. So the rate, not really a price, but the rate equals average cost. And if you've taken a microeconomics class, one equation you probably remembered, perhaps not the conditions for that equation, is prices in an efficient market should equal marginal cost, not average cost, right? And so if you remember that, you may not believe it. I suspect many of you don't believe it, but you should. Then you see we have potentially an efficiency problem. We'll get to that. Frank previously showed this slide. The y-axis is the annual percent increases over time. And when the industry was going through its golden years and the annual growth rates were 7, 10%, every 7 or 10 years, 10 or 7 years, the industry would double. you know, growth solves everything. So if you look at a formula for stock prices, and that last term is growth, if that growth is above the discount rate, it just makes the value of the stock go very high. So growth solves everything, almost everything, at least from a financial perspective. Okay, so what's going on? So we have this solar, so I have a little solar panel on my house, and I'm using this grid, and as you see in the blue piece, there's a net meter. And so it's just an artifact of the technology of the electric meters at your house or apartment that if you push power from the house to the grid, put aside some safety issues, that meter will run backwards. It's like your car. You know, if you, old cars or old odometers, I guess, on cars, if you drove the car backwards, the odometer would spin in the opposite direction. So if you drove 1,000 miles forward and 1,000 miles backwards, even though you put 2,000 miles on the engine, the odometer would just show 0. You would sell it to your idiot brother-in-law and make a bundle, because he didn't really ask the question, how did you own a car for 2 years and never drive it? But obviously, if you go to whoever pays for roads and say, well, my net travel distance was 0, why am I paying road taxes? Right, it's a silly question. So obviously, the solar panel, in part, is relying on the grid, and we've kind of shrunk, or it's typically not surprising given our bills. We think about the grid, in this case, the transmission distribution system, delivering kilowatt hours, but it actually provides a wide range of services beyond that. So, for example, and actually I'm jumping ahead, but here's the death spiral. We have this net metering, for example. I'm not, motivated by very good public policy reasons. We have a declining sales in electricity. We have fixed costs are now being recovered over a much smaller denominator. The rate then goes up, just think to the formula I just showed up, and that increases the price, which means makes even solar panels on Shady Street cost effective, and you have this death spiral. And so you have this technical picture. And if you're going to believe the industry, and God love them, you get to this picture, right? You get to Alice in Wonderland. What are some asides? First of all, death spiral is a little much. It has a variety of names, the existential crisis, which I referred to at the beginning, the solar vortex, because now everything has to be linked to a cold weather spell in January. And to be fair, there may be other sources of revenues for the utilities. And the question I'm really asking is not how to make the electric utility industry viable. The question is, should we have an electric utility industry? How should it be structured? And then if we think we should, then of course it has to be financially viable. Otherwise, we'll never get the investments in order to meet our environmental, social, economic, and other goals. But there are other potential revenue streams for the utilities. Smart grid, whatever that means, let me know. Electric vehicles, which smart grid's really a term, an umbrella term that captures many things. Okay. So let's look at our electric utility bill. I'm just making up the numbers. We're paying 20 cents a kilowatt hour. What does that equal? Well, you're paying for the generation to be delivered from the centralized power station to your house. So that would include losses. Let's say that's 10 cents a kilowatt hour. You're paying for transmission and distribution, the delivery, but also the other services which I'll mention, the balancing, the quality control, the reliability. Let's just assume that's 8 cents a kilowatt hour. And then typically there's a tax or a surge charge or a combination, depends on the state, that fund things that we use revenues for. So in the case of New Jersey, the societal benefits charge, which funds various energy efficiency, renewable, and other very important programs. So here's the question, how do we allocate this fixed cost? Primarily, there are fixed costs in generation as well, but really the fixed costs for transmission and distribution. Okay, so in my view, unless the grid doesn't have value, which I think it will for many years to come, if not for even longer, but unless the grid doesn't have value, but if the grid does have value, we're still going to finance it. We're going to need it for the balancing services, the reliability, the resiliency, and so forth. Now that grid tomorrow may look very different from the grid today once we're integrating behind-the-meter generation, smart technologies, perhaps plug-in vehicles, more of a two-way flow, both in terms of information but also in terms of power. The actual structure of the grid, the physics, not the physics so much, that won't change, but the infrastructure of it will change as we get, we can squeeze out capital savings with behind-the-meter generation, for example. So given that assumption, I think we'll still want to fund the grid. So how do we go about doing that? Well, here's the choice. If we don't, the grid will deteriorate, and given that I assume that we think it has value, we want to avoid that. So how do we do this? So now we have our little house, the solar, the sun is running, the net metering is occurring, but the panel, that house is using the grids, it's using it at night, for example, but even if it had storage, and storage is coming down and cost effective, really there are many types of storage that we need to run the grid. But in any event, if we have a rainy day, like Eeyore, then we still want to use the grid, and we have to figure out how to, this house who's benefiting from the grid, not just in terms of the delivery of electrons, but the backup storage, supply, and so forth. How do we do that? Well, just to extend that picture, if you think of microgrids, which Frank alluded to before, mentioned, distributed generation, combined heat and power, all that, plug-in vehicles, I realize this is a very busy picture, but what should pop out at you are the blue lines, the interconnections, the fact that this is a network, that there's value in networking all these different new and emerging technologies in an intelligent or smart way. And to the extent that is the case, then we want to be able, from a societal point of view, I would think, want to be able to figure out how do we fund this grid. Okay, so there is an exit. Change rate design. So time to fall asleep. And it's Economics 101, or my limited understanding of Economics 101. If you have a large fixed cost, you want to recover that in a fixed portion of a bill. So my suggestion is we move to a two-part tariff. This is nothing new. The industry knew this from the beginning of the industry. There was a debate and a discussion about how you should structure rates. This is not just unique to the electric power industry, it's unique to, it pertains to almost every capital-intensive industry. So this is nothing new. I'm not trying to claim this is some great insight. I'm just saying that we're going to have to move that way, I think, in order to maintain the usefulness of the grid to advance public policy objectives. So what would the new bill look like? Well, you would have a fixed charge, that's the F. Let's say it's $200 a month. And then you would pay a volumetric charge times your quantity that you used in that month. Now, because the transmission distribution company is a regulated monopoly, and I'll relax that assumption coming up, then the amount that they can recover is set by ratepayers. And as a result, if you transfer money from a volumetric charge into a fixed charge, the volumetric charge, the per unit charge, has to decrease. Now that has some important implications. One is equity. So we do many things with the electric power grid. It's not just to advance economic efficiency. Swirling around the regulatory process are stakeholders with various important interests, all the way from economic development to protecting seniors or disadvantaged populations or low-income populations. And so we do use the system, the electric power system in part, particularly on the distribution rates, to address perhaps perhaps not, issues of equity. So we can maintain that through the fixed charge. So my view is this is an important consideration. We don't want to unwind equity issues, but it can be handled, in my view, in this two-part tariff, fixed and variable charge. The more difficult part is these externalities. So the pollution, greenhouse gases, other air emissions, other pollutants, and I would even add energy security if you've read a newspaper recently. And if we drop that margin, the volumetric charge, going forward, a consumer was no longer paying 20 cents per kilowatt hour. They're paying a fixed charge. Once they pay that fixed charge, their variable charge going forward is 10 cents a kilowatt hour. So what do you do if you lower prices? We're going to use more electricity. Now, I'm sure everyone in here is a good person and you want it, but I would. Okay, so I'm going to go home, I'm going to leave my lights on, buy the extra plasma TV, have an electric heater when my tootsies get cold. That's what I'm going to do, okay? Of course, I may buy an electric vehicle because now it's cheaper to run that. But if you think, which I suspect many people in this room are, and I agree completely, that we're not capturing all the externalities, greenhouse gases would be a big one, but not the only one by any means, we have a problem. Because now we corrected one efficiency problem, the fact that we're covering fixed charge from a volumetric charge, but we've now opened up because we don't have the correct price signal on the generation side accounting for the externality. So back to our low bill, we're paying 20 cents a kilowatt hour. We have a fixed charge. The generation is variable, let's say, just to make it conceptually easy. But we're not including the environmental externalities. And depending on your point of view, maybe they rise almost to the 20-cent bill, or maybe they're even larger. Okay, so when we change the rate design on the distribution side and transmission side, we potentially open ourselves up on the generation side. And what's interesting about that, at least in the US, they're regulated by 2 different jurisdictions, roughly, except for Texas, and that's always an exception. But it's on the retail side, it's at the state level. At the wholesale side, for our purposes, it's at the federal level. So we need to fix that pricing problem, which raises its own set of issues, REGI, and you can go down the list. But at least in economics, 2 wrongs may make a right, so that's fun to say. It's called the theorem of the second best. I would like to say the 29th best, because we have a series of pricing inefficiencies that ripple through the systems. But here's, I think, a good example where if we don't understand the economics, which come about from the technology, just the physics of how transmission and distribution system works, what makes a good idea may actually give unintended consequences, and that's part of the system or the interdisciplinary flavor I hope we are getting today. So what's the third regulatory challenge? Well, as I mentioned, the rate making is not just about economic efficiency, it's not just about doing calculus problems, pinheads like me, it's about promoting, advancing, negotiating various values, competing interests. So it's not just a simple calculus problem. If it was, we'd probably be worse off, but we'd be. So, you know, to continue the Alice in Wonderland, it's the Mad Hatter. And within that environment, there's a lot of strategic behavior, that's economists speak for lying, and misunderstandings about what's really going on. So here's some final thoughts. If the grid continues to provide value, then I think we're going to move, and we are moving. We did this in natural gas in this state, but throughout the US, we're moving towards, we may call it by different names, but a fixed charge or something like a fixed charge. And that's my little diagram of the network. So even in the utility of the future of 20 or 30 years from now, if you think the network is providing those integration, reliability, informational services, we need to figure out how to capture those costs and do that in an efficient way. If it turns out that I can put a solar panel on my house and have storage and I can go off grid, then this rate design works as well. Because I would look at my fixed charge, I would look at my variable charge and say, hey, given my needs for reliability, or given that I'm on the sunny side of the street or whatever, I can just implement, for example, solar panels with storage. And I may decide to disconnect from the grid. And if that becomes widespread, we shouldn't be investing in the grid. The purpose of the utility is not to have them a business model. The purpose of the utility is to be useful. So we can live off-grid like this, but depending on your notions of what off-grid living is, maybe it's more like The Hobbit. So, I don't know if people saw Mad Men last week, but there's at the commune. But anyway, so more final thoughts. You know, I get paid by the word here. Let's start thinking about stranded costs. Now, I was at a conference and I ran into my advisor. I hadn't seen him in 20 years. And up came the issue of stranded costs, which we were debating or discussing 20 years ago, and we both looked at each other and said, oh my God. I mean, I thought, great, I can pay for my kids' college education, but I'm not sure we're advancing the interests of society. But given that the grid may fundamentally change the distribution system, let's think ahead about how do we avoid, and as we start investing, make large investments in resiliency and strengthening and hardening utility assets, let's not find out in 10 years from now or 20 years from now, or at least let's think through what happens if we no longer need those types of investments. Potentially, I could see a future, I don't know when, I'm not good at predicting the future or the past, but when microgrids may be sufficient, that we could, quote, deregulate the T&D side of the system, have that as competitive entry, and the utility through market forces, the T&D portion, if they raise rates too high, I then build my solar panel with my battery or whatever, or I connect through a microgrid, but I'm off the grid, the utility grid. And so that's definitely a possibility. And so that would be interesting, and then the utilities would be forced to either to provide a business model based on competitive forces, like many of them are required to now on the generation side. Some final thoughts, focus on the prize. Let's get the marginal cost right, pricing right, but that is a big lift. It's not an economic problem, it's a political problem. So, Congressman, if you could take care of that for me, I'd appreciate it. And this is where the rhetoric gets into. You know, I'm not a rhetorician, I was in the Navy, I was an engineer, I tend to speak directly, but my suspicion is trying to convince people by calling them names isn't helpful. You just gotta suck it up. I don't know how to do it, but I think that's really the problem, is how do you convince people who have different beliefs, and I think that's where we're at. And this gives rise to the issue of, we got to be careful when imposing policies because we need to try to think through the implications and unwind certain implications as the policy changes over time. And with that, thank you very much.
About 5 minutes for discussion.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm a professional engineer, and I've been following solar installations and everything. And knowing the direction of technology, the fact that solar panels went from like $7 a watt down to under $1, the innovations in battery technology, and if you're in suburban or rural areas of New Jersey, it appears that you could get completely off of the grid if you wanted to. And I've seen studies where in certain parts of the country, like Hawaii, that could be now, and they're saying New York, New Jersey in 10 years where we reach grid parity. But I also see that the people that are putting solar panels up, and they're usually through power purchase agreements where really there's more wealthy people that own the panels and get the solar credits and so on. I see that there's this need to maintain that equipment. When you put panels and batteries in your house, this stuff can be lethal. And just like you have your air conditioning and your heating systems, they need to be maintained. There's a role for the power company to do that kind of stuff now. Not always to have transmission lines, or if they do have transmission lines.
So then the economic, because perhaps that's your question. Okay. But why is it unique? Why is that role unique to the power company? Why can't that be my local electrician? So this gets into the issue we can open up to competitive supply. Why do I have to buy that service from PSE&G? Why can't I buy it just like my plumber doesn't come from PSE&G or my heating installation person? So this gives rise, you raise a good point, the role of markets. So my goal is not to make a role for the power company. I think there's an important role for them. And to the extent it's a regulated service, my view would be only to provide regulated service where we think competition won't get the outcomes that we want. But I would open that up and even to the power company and let them compete to provide the maintenance contracts on solar panels or storage as well. The other point is I'm not really good at predicting where technology will go, but if we set up the rate design correctly, then if that happens in New Jersey in 5 years or 20 years or 2 years, the regulators don't have to guess. They set up the incentives correctly. Very difficult job, easy for me to say, so that you decide when it is appropriate to leave the grid, and others may not. And then it's your decision. Yes, sir.
When a power company buys back electricity from a solar panel, for example, do they buy it back at the same price that they sell it?
Yeah, they buy it back at retail. That's the issue. And at least in New Jersey, not in every state, but yeah. And
wouldn't they be entitled to some payment for the use of the grid in that case, because you can't sell the power back to the power company without a grid?
Right. So that's exactly my point, and it's to the advantage of the home with the solar panel on it, because when they have excess power production, hot day, but they're not at home, not running the air conditioner, they're selling it back to the grid. They're using the roads and so forth. The reason policymakers went down that route for good reasons was to jumpstart the industry, in my view, and to get us there. And now, as that's really taken off for the reasons the previous gentleman alluded to, drop in prices and actually successful policy, if you want to look at it that way, it now creates this other problem. And so I think we're going to have to move, as you indicate, to a way to take full advantage of it. That's right. Whoever you want to. Beatrice runs the show.
On that question about paying the rate that should be paid to the folks who own the solar panels, what do you think holds the most promise for setting those rates? Are you in favor of Minnesota's approach for value of solar tariff, or how do you think the state PUC should go about setting the rates that solar panel owners are receiving for their power?
Mine is internalize the externality on the generation side, have fixed costs, recovery for the fixed costs, and then you can, either through a carbon tax or other taxes, it's not just carbon or greenhouse gases or cap and trade system. And then there will be, the price signals will be right, and someone will install solar or energy efficiency or demand response or nuclear fission or go down the list. Unfortunately, that world is far, far away for a long reason. So then we have the last question I had, one of the last questions, how do we move forward when we have all these other pricing imperfections given, and the realities of building coalitions and persuading the other side, or somewhat, that is, I think, an open question. It's easy for me to say, assume a can opener, I can open a can. The problem is, how do we, build that can opener? Social cost of carbon is very important, though.
Frank, I was wondering, with the commercial metering systems or the demand charge, is that similar to what you're talking about as far as the...
Right, and what I don't know is typically, like for large industrial, the demand charges, and I oversimplified, so I'm not, you're exactly right. In a 15-minute or 30-minute interval, so that's more like the tariff. Like I said, this isn't a new proposal by any means. It's 100 years old, even older than I am, but, I think we're going to have to move back towards that idea. Yeah. Great, thank you very much. Have a good day.